I am so thrilled to see all of you this morning. I'm Evangeline Kovac. I'm the one who does all the logistics for the Barnes Science and Faith Symposium, and it's just so exciting to see all of you here, and especially because you are here to hear Brother Guy Consolmango speak. For those of you who did not see him at 4 o'clock or 7:30 yesterday, I feel sorry for you because it was wonderful. He just has a great way of expressing himself and explaining himself, and it was great, but it will be wonderful this morning too. Brother Guy has been the president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation since 2014, so that means he is essentially the Pope's astronomer. He studied planetary sciences at MIT, where he earned his bachelor's and master's degree. He completed his PhD in 1978. He was a researcher at Harvard and MIT, and he served in the U.S. Peace Corps in Kenya. And he taught physics at Lafayette College before joining the Jesuits in 1989. He began serving as an astronomer at the Vatican Observatory in 1993 and was a curator of the Vatican Meteorite collection until his appointment as president in 2014. He's been elected to the governing boards of many kind of organizations, and along with 200 scientific publications, he's the author of 6 popular astronomy books, one entitled, "Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial?" and Other Questions from the Astronomer's Inbox at the Vatican Observatory. Without further ado, I would just like to introduce you to Brother Guy Consolmango.
Thank you. I want this to be mostly a Q&A session. I'll just start things going by telling a story that fits into the theme of being a Christian, being a scientist. I entered the Jesuits when I was about 37, and I did 2 years as a novice doing basic training before taking vows. And the first summer, the director of novices says to me, "You should spend some time doing some science so you stay in contact with your field." And this was kind of nerve-wracking for me because this would be the first time I'd be out in public with the collar, so to speak, even though I don't normally wear the collar. During that time, as part of the training, we worked in a sheltered workshop. They had me working in a sheltered workshop for severely mentally handicapped men who basically live in a group home, come and put things in plastic bags, and they get paid a small salary. Gives them something to do, gives them a place to socialize, and then they get classes and training on how to cope in the real world when you've got an IQ of 35. And tremendously important work, and really, really difficult for someone like me, who's frankly a nerd. And then I went off one afternoon where I should have been there. I went to the Goddard Space Flight Center to interview, to set up my appointment. And as I'm having lunch at the cafeteria at the Goddard Space Flight Center, I said, normally today I'd be in a room full of mostly men who are 60 to 70 points away from the norm in the IQ, who have a hard time dressing themselves and stumble and sort of don't know how to deal with people. And I look at all the scientists around me and I go, yeah, just like this place. I wind up working at Goddard, and my first day on the job, a woman who I have known for a long time, scientist who I've known for a long time, goes, "Guy, you're a Jesuit?" I go, "Well, yeah." As if, you go to church? Well, yeah. "Did you always go to church?" "Well, yeah." As if you couldn't tell, it's just never would have thought, considering the way you lived, I guess. I don't know. She says, "We have to talk." And I've got this sinking feeling, because she is one of her fellow grad students back when she was a grad student would always refer to her behind her back as "she who must be obeyed." She had this way of looking at you and you immediately go, "Is my fly down?" She could look through you. And she also was a brilliant scientist, still is a brilliant scientist. She's actually vice president of research at MIT today. And we sit down and she goes, "So you're a Catholic?" I go, "Yeah." And she proceeded to tell me about her parish priest, her family, her kids, this entire side of her life that I never knew. And I go, "Oh, this was not what I expected." Another time when I'm studying philosophy in Chicago, and I was taking a course at the University of Chicago along with the other ones I was taking at Loyola University in the North Side. And since I'm on campus, I thought I'd visit some of my fellow meteorite scientists. So I go into this one professor, and again, he's got the reputation of being tough. You make a mistake, he's going to zing you. And he would do this in public. You know, you give a paper, and he would find the flaw and make sure that everybody else knew that you had made a flaw and that he had found it. And I go in and we chat, and he was very friendly and welcomes me and, introduces me to some of the grad students because he knew my work. And he says, "What are you in town for?" And I say, "Well, I'm studying philosophy now. I've become a Jesuit." And I could feel the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. This was not something he wanted to hear. Okay, I was expecting this. So I'm making a few polite noises. I'm about to get up and leave. And he goes, "Were you always a Catholic?" I'm going, "An Italian dad, an Irish mom, what do you think? Come on." And suddenly he's really friendly again. And we chat some more, and we talk another 20 minutes, and he goes, "I've got to get you out to my synagogue to give a talk." Only a few minutes later did I realize, curly hair, I had a reddish beard in those days, he thought I was Jewish. He thought I was an apostate Jew who had left Judaism. As soon as he found out that wasn't the case, I was an Irish and Italian kid, it wasn't that he was mad at me for being religious, it was that he was so passionately committed to his religion, that he was so deeply religious, something I never knew. Over and over and over again, as I've gone around in my scientific career, I've met many people who I thought I knew who now feel they have permission to talk about their religion to me. And the kind of surveys that people have done suggest that the proportion of scientists who are religious believers or active in a church isn't all that much different from the population that they come from. And I suspect, this university, this is an odd case, but if you go to the University of Rochester, you'd find the proportions. If you wanted to find atheists on the University of Rochester campus, don't go to the physics department. English literature, maybe. They don't believe in truth over there. But science is part of our lives because scientists are human beings. And as human beings, we have exactly the same questions. We have exactly the same desires to know. We have exactly the same sense of, and especially I think even more as a scientist, you're less likely to try to find God on your own and more likely to accept that an organized, systematic way of learning it is certainly a lot more time efficient than trying to invent theology. That'd be like trying to invent calculus on your own. Theoretically possible, doesn't happen too often. So with that in mind, that sense of my experience of being a scientist and someone who's a religious believer, I'll throw the questions open to you. Questions that you might have about how do you live the two lives? How do you reconcile them? How do I see other people living them? What works, what doesn't? That sort of thing. Some of you may have science backgrounds. Here I am, a test subject that you can poke and prod and see what answers you come up with. Yeah. Meteorites are actually not beautiful to look at. As rocks go, they're pretty ugly rocks. But knowing what they are, suddenly you see the beauty inside them. It's kind of like 30 years ago, there was a really mediocre movie that I suspect none of you ever saw called Times Square. And it was made in the days back before Disney turned Times Square, New York, into a big tourist attraction. In the late 70s, early 80s, Times Square was like a real dump of a place that people were scared to go to. The only cool thing about the movie was that the opening scene, they do a pan around Times Square, and you see the winos and the drug addicts and the creepy people, and you go, oh, oh. And by the end of the movie, they do exactly the same pan, only because of the movie, you know who each of those individuals are and you know their stories. And suddenly you love them. Once you know the story of a meteorite, and it's a fascinating story, that it is a lump of rock that was witness to the formation of the solar system, that is 4.5 billion years old, and has suffered all sorts of beatings and bruising since then, and you can trace through and you say, oh, when did this happen? Who did this to you? And how did you survive to today? And how did you get here from where you came from? All of that story can be found within the rocks. But a lot of it is simply knowing that you're holding a piece of outer space. That blue sky there is not an impenetrable barrier. But it is possible for things to come through that blue sky to us, with the promise that maybe it's also possible for us to go through that blue sky out beyond, that away. Other questions? Yeah.
You said at one point,
Right.
yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
Okay. You said if we had any questions about what works and what doesn't work with theology and science, what doesn't work?
What I think doesn't work is to say I'm a scientist Monday through Friday and a religious person on Sunday. Building this wall. There was a fellow named Stephen Jay Gould who was a marvelous writer on science, and he's written a number of popular books. He was a biologist. He sadly died a few years ago. And he was not a believer, and he didn't get religion, but he knew that religion was important. And so he wrote a book that he tried to figure out how he would reconcile the two. And it was a remarkable failure. And part of it was that his answer was what he called non-overlapping magisteria. That there is the region of questions that science shouldn't touch and the region of questions that religion shouldn't touch. And the flaw with that approach is that I'm not two people. I'm one person. I'm the person who believes and I'm the person who's curious. And my belief motivates my curiosity, and my curiosity challenges, in a good way, my beliefs. So that each side in me not just talks to each other, but it's not really that I'm two sides, I'm one person. The passion that I get dealing with meteorites is ultimately a passion for the Creator. It's the same passion. The joy I feel when I make a discovery is the same joy I feel when, in a moment of prayer, when God has touched me and goes, yep, still here. And we are only as integrated people that we can be fully a scientist and fully a believer. What's more, after a while, if you think that there's two sides, then you begin to fall into the trap of thinking, well, science is a big book of facts. That's how they taught it to me in grade school. I had to memorize the facts to pass the science class. Must be a big book of facts. Religion is a big book of facts, because that's how I had to pass my religion class, in Sunday school class, memorize these verses. Well, there's a reason why they made you do that when you were a grade school kid, because, 10-year-olds can't do much more than that. And you have to have some stuff to work with before you have to know the scales before you can play the music. But the scales aren't the music. Science isn't a big book of facts. Religion isn't a big book of facts. There's never a fear that this fact is going to interfere with that fact. Why would she be afraid that religion tells me one thing and science tells me another? When it happens in science that this scientist tells me one thing and that scientist tells me a different thing, and they're both right, I get excited. Because I know I'm about to learn something new. And it should be the same way when my faith is challenged so that I realize what I thought I understood. Oh, it's not that easy. It's a whole lot more interesting than that. And the science that I thought I knew, no, actually it doesn't make sense. Newtonian physics is great. You tell me the position, and you tell me the speed, and you tell me the force, and I can tell you where that particle's going to go. Position relative to what? Speed relative to what? And then when you say, well, relative to the Earth, but the Earth is moving. Well, relative to the solar system, but the solar system is moving. Well, relative to the galaxy, but the galaxy is moving. And you realize, ultimately, wait a minute, there is no inertial frame like they tell you about in Physics 101. The entire thing collapses if you push it too far. It doesn't mean that Newtonian physics is a waste of time. It means it's a very narrow, special case of something that's a whole lot more interesting. And likewise, we think of original sin and salvation in terms of, the people of Israel. Well, there are more people than just the people of Israel. Oh, all the Gentiles. Well, there's more people than just the Gentiles. Jesus himself says in John's Gospel, I have other sheep that you don't know about. Now, he was probably talking to Jews about Gentiles. But who knows? Maybe he's talking about the sheep over in Alpha Centauri. And what does that mean, to us? And what does our salvation mean? And what does Jesus mean? When suddenly you realize he's dealing not with just the people in this room, but an entire universe that's so big we can't comprehend it. And so you lose that richness if you don't let the two sides talk to each other. Yeah. You got a microphone coming so they can hear you.
Given your background with faith and science, how do you interpret the creation days?
Yeah. Being Catholic and being raised in the Catholic tradition, it has almost never been Catholic teaching that Scripture should be taken literally in that sense. The only time they dabbled with it was when they ran up against Galileo, and we saw how that turned out. St. Augustine wrote a book on the literal interpretation of Genesis around the year 400. And in it, I'm not sure I buy his idea of literal. It would be actually what we would call literary, because he sees everything in Genesis as allegory. The ancient church fathers are crazy about this. I think it was Gregory of Nyssa who takes the story of the Exodus and says, you think Exodus is a story of Moses and the people of Israel leaving Egypt? It's actually a biography of Jesus. They just didn't know that. And you go, what? So they're very ready, probably too ready, to read allegories into everything. That's the way that ancient people thought. But Augustine makes a really good point in this book on the literal interpretation of Genesis, where he says, if you express what's described in Genesis as opposed to what the best science of the day tells is true, the people hearing you are going to think you're crazy. They're never going to read the rest of Genesis. They're not going to get the important stuff there, and you're doing a disservice to Scripture. He actually says it in a much more harsh way than that. And the irony is, of course, that the best science of their day, 400 BC or 400 AD, we now know is totally wrong. But the point remains the same. I put it a different way. You're a student, you're taking a biology class. Are you going to use the same biology book that your dad used when he was in college? Of course not. You're a student, you're taking a Shakespeare class. You going to use the same copy of the complete works of Shakespeare that your mom used when she was in college? Why not? May even have good notes on the side. Are you going to use the same copy of Plato? Are you going to use the same copy of... There are certain books that in and of themselves are what we study. And there are certain books that are merely a compendium of what we think we know at the moment. The first books are science and philosophy, and the first books are philosophy and literature especially. And the other books tend to be science books. Science books go out of date. I've written science books, trust me, they're out of date. Do you want to treat the Bible as if it was a book that you have to throw away in 5 years? Or do you treat the Bible as something that is as good now as it was 2,500 years ago? And that is the tragedy I see with people who want to take the story of Genesis and say, aha, that matches modern physics, is they're given modern physics too much credit. modern physics of 2017 is going to be ancient and wrong physics in 3017. But Genesis is still going to be fabulous. So the thing that is fabulous in Genesis is not the thing that's going to be out of date. When Genesis was written, they took the best science of the day and the stories that everybody had already heard, the Gilgamesh, the creation stories of the Babylonians, and they said, they got it wrong. Here is what really happened. Creation was not by accident. Creation was not by gods inside creation making things happen. The point of creation was not to build the city of Babylon. What really happened in the beginning was God was already there, because God's not a nature God. God was there and deliberately chose. God was there, and the first thing he chose was to make sure that he's doing everything in the light so that nothing's hidden. God's there, deliberately chooses, and at every stage of the way says, this is good. And the point and the climax and the end of the arc of Genesis 1 is the Sabbath. Why are we here? To love God, not to grow crops and take care of cows. Growing crops and taking care of cows, you have to do that so we can live. But on the seventh day, where we're aiming for is the chance to know and love God, and to know and love God's creation. And if you get all hung up on, well, was the first day or the second day that lights were missing the point. You ever read Shakespeare's Macbeth? Opening scene of Macbeth. There's the witches stirring away their brew, and it's bubble, bubble, toil and trouble, eye of newt, and whatever. And it's not a cookbook. You're not supposed to pull out those words and say, oh, is that how I do magic? You're missing the point of Shakespeare if that's how you read it. That's where I'm coming from anyway. Yeah.
My question is a little bit two-parted. The first part is, why did you choose to be a Jesuit? And the second part is, what are you hoping to add to the church or to the work being done at the Vatican as a scientist?
Yeah. I chose the Jesuits, to be perfectly honest, because I knew them. I'd gone to a Jesuit high school in, like McQuaid is the Jesuit high school here in Rochester. I went to the Jesuit high school in Detroit. And I had heard about them even before I went to that high school, that they were the smart guys. I always wanted to be the smart guy. That was my mental image of myself as a little kid. I was terrible at sports, but I was almost the smartest kid in the class. And if I worked really hard, maybe I could have been. The smartest kid in my class actually was a girl named Maria, and I wound up taking her to the senior prom. And we're still great friends to this day. But I knew from high school that these were people that I felt comfortable with. And I did look at other orders, and I admire the other orders in the Catholic Church. The Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Benedictines. Each of them has their own sort of thing. Each of them has their own kind of stereotype. Franciscan, a Dominican, and a Jesuit are playing golf. And the group in front of them is taking forever. And so they call the golf pro over and they say, can you have them like move aside so we can play through? And the golf pro says, normally I'd be happy to do that, but that group ahead of you, it's special, they've never played before. And it's taken them a little bit of time because you see they're all blind. Kind of hard to play golf when you're blind, but you want to give them the chance. And the Dominican, the order of St. Thomas Aquinas and the great theologians, the theological significance of a blind man playing golf reminds me of something St. Thomas once wrote, and he goes on with it. And the Franciscan just goes, yes, brother blindness has so much to teach all of us. And the Jesuit goes, well, yeah, but how come they can't play at night? That's the different personalities. So I figured that third one, that's me. That's me. What I hope to do at the observatory is mostly to give my fellow scientists a comfortable place where they can do their science, where they can be good scientists so that the people they collaborate with will respect that, yeah, the church not just supports science, but supports real science. But also to explain to the people in this room, and everybody you're going to talk to, and everybody in the next place I'm going to talk, that the church loves science. Don't let the atheists take the science away from you. This is good stuff. This is a way you get to know the Creator. This is something that God wants us to do. And don't let the atheists steal it with their lies. So that's my, yeah.
My question is, how do your discoveries shape how you view God and how you worship?
They do. Because my discoveries, the way I see the universe works, gives me a sense of God's personality. I had a student come up after one of the talks last night saying, so God's, all-powerful. How come he doesn't make the sun blue? How come he doesn't? And I don't know how come. But I do know this is how he did it. One of the glories of theology is a principle that is the scandal of particularity. God doesn't love the human race. He loves you. And you, and you. Not sure about you, but you. That he loves individual people. God didn't come as a mystic force that settled on the earth and turned us all into good people. He came as a particular person in a particular setting at a particular time. After a while, when you do science, you're faced with a problem and you see this particular odd thing going on, and if you're creative, you can think of 12 different ways to explain that. And you have no idea which one is correct until you do the research. Which one do you choose first? The one that you think is the most likely. How do you know which one's going to be the most likely? The one that best matches the way you've seen nature working all along. That's God's personality. And if I could summarize God's personality, it's elegance. It's combining a really simple but clever way of doing things that when you see it makes you smile. The theory that's most likely to be true is the theory that's most likely to be beautiful. And that means, of course, you have to train yourself to know beauty so that you're not pursuing a beauty that's really, Elvis painted on black velvet, but one that is truly beautiful. I said that once, and I had a bunch of people who loved Elvis and black velvet get mad at me, but sorry about that.
One thing that always fascinated me was, how do you determine the age of something millions of light years away?
It's all done with theory, and it can all be changed tomorrow. The amazing thing to me, having been a theorist, that they say in science, nobody believes the theorist except the theorist. And everybody believes the guy who collects the data except the guy who collected the data, who knows all the things that went into it. Science is like watching sausage being made. There's lots of shortcuts, there's lots of what-ifs. It is a house of cards. And the reason we trust it is only if we have more than one way of coming to the same conclusion. And even then, it's not true. It's not. I have a theory that that switch in the back of the room controls these lights. Now, I can go to that switch and flip it, and the lights go out, and I say, aha, I'm right. But it might be that he is actually flipping the real switch just to fool me, just to think that that was a switch that controlled it. There's a story of a guy who went to a VIP, went to the baseball game in Milwaukee where they've got this retractable roof. And the mayor is there, with the VIP, and he says, "Oh, Mr. VIP, we're going to let you retract the roof." And he hands him his television clicker. And he says, wait, all right, now. And he says, now it's 7 o'clock, because he knows that's when the roof is going to open. And the guy hits the clicker and thinks he did it. How do we know that we're not being fooled? What counts as a scientific demonstration is never a proof, not the way that a math proof is. And later on, we can be fooled into thinking that what we thought was true is not. It means that all the data are true, but we come to a deeper understanding. So, how do we come up with these ages? Part of it is we think we understand how stars shine. We didn't know that 100 years ago. We didn't even know that 75 years ago. But we think now we know how stars shine. And you can calculate how much stuff will shine, and how long will it take until. And you can even calculate what's going to happen when the fuel runs out. And one of the things you calculate is that the bigger stars burn faster. They go through their fuel faster, and then they turn red. And you look at a cluster of stars, like the Pleiades, that all seem to be formed at the same time from the same cloud, only some of those stars have already turned red. And you do your calculation, you say, oh, well, a star of that brightness would have needed, 2 million years to burn out, so that cluster must be at least 2 million years old. Or you can say there's a cluster of stars, and they're all moving in an orbit around the center of the galaxy, but they've begun to spread out. How long ago was it when if I trace their orbits back, when they were all in the same place? And it comes out to about 2 million years. And I go, oh, there's two different arguments that tell me that that cluster is 2 million years old. I'm going to assume that that's right until somebody comes up with another argument that tells me it's wrong. Does it ever happen? Yeah. We had theories that told us that globular clusters were 11 billion years old at a time when the Hubble constant suggested that the entire universe was only 10 billion years old. And you go, oh, how can the cluster be older than the universe? Somebody's wrong someplace. And then you're excited and you try to figure out who got it wrong. It turns out the Hubble constant was wrong. The universe is really 14 billion years old, so solve that one for the moment. But it's constantly going back and checking your assumptions, constantly going back and saying, does this really work? When you read things in a textbook, it's because whoever wrote the textbook is trying to cram as much into your head as quickly as possible so that when you enter into the conversation with the scientists doing the work, you'll know what they're talking about. But once you enter into that conversation, you discover it's a whole lot less cut and dried than it said in the textbook. We've got this summer school for students who are finishing their undergraduate, beginning graduate work in astronomy. Every 2 years, we bring 25 students from around the world, really bright students. They spend 4 weeks working with some of the best astronomers in the world. And I overheard 2 students. One was a grad student and one was an undergrad, saying the difference between being an undergraduate astronomy major and being a graduate student going into the field astronomy major. And they says, when you're an undergraduate and you go home for Christmas and your mom asks you about black holes, you say, well, actually, they really don't understand those very well. But when you're a graduate student and you go home and your mom asks you about black holes, you say, well, we don't really understand those very well yet. Other questions? Over there first.
Why does this eternal being have to have existed and then started the Big Bang? Why couldn't the universe have just started and then operate under these natural rules?
But the universe may very well have started itself. If you say, Stephen Hawking has this theory, which is a lovely theory, and I'm not going to dispute it, that before the Big Bang, if you have a universe that's totally empty, the flat shape of the universe itself contains energy. And gravity is the warping of the universe. But because of quantum uncertainty, it will start warping itself randomly. And if you wait long enough, one of those warps will be big enough to start the Big Bang going. And therefore, he says, I don't need God to start the Big Bang, gravity did it. Now let's carefully parse what he's saying. He's saying that God is proposed to be the thing that started the Big Bang. But I am saying that gravity is the thing that started the Big Bang. Therefore, it's not there is no God, it's that gravity is God, if that's his definition of God. Now, if gravity is God, that would explain why Catholics celebrate Mass. I can see those of you who have had physics and those who haven't. But that's really not what he's trying to say. The creation of the universe out of nothing, an idea that's first written down in the book of Maccabees, is not that there was a vacuum and God did something. Even the vacuum is something. Even space and time is something. Even the laws of quantum physics that say that there's this fundamental uncertainty and randomness, that's something. When we say God created out of nothing, we're saying God created space and time and the laws of physics, if you will. But notice something else. When we say, in the beginning, God's already there at the beginning. God's already there before space and time. God is outside of space and time. So all time is there when God is. And creation and the existence of space and time is not something that just happened once at one point in time, but happens always at all points in time. So creation is not something that happened 13.8 billion years ago. It's something that's happening right now. God maintains the existence of the universe. Now, you can say, I don't need God for that. And when I ask, what do you have instead? You go, I don't know, but it doesn't have to be God. And I can argue two ways. I can say, whatever it is, that's what I'm going to define God to be, which is, kind of cheaty. Or I can say, you're absolutely right. You can come up with a self-consistent physical system that ultimately is based on chaos, ultimately is based on randomness, ultimately is based on, and what we call the laws of physics are just probabilistic, this is what usually happens. And probably not too far from the truth. Or I could start with the idea that there is a God, a creator God, who actually intends this to be. Both of those systems are self-consistent. What this means is I cannot use science to prove God. But that's all right, I knew that, because any God who could be proved would be subsidiary to the thing that proved him, and that wouldn't be God. But every logical system starts with assumptions, starts with axioms. You're going to do Euclidean geometry, you have to start, let's say the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. I can't prove that. I just said that's so self-evidently obvious that I'm going to start that as one of my 17 axioms. And 16 of them are really obvious, and then there's that one about parallel lines that is really hard to explain. And turns out isn't true everywhere. If you're on the surface of a sphere, for example. If your beginning axiom is, okay, I'm going to assume there's a God, does the universe make sense with this assumption? Yes. Doesn't prove my assumption is correct, but at least it proves my assumption isn't wrong. Does the universe look different if I believe that there's a good God underneath it versus if I believe that there's an evil God underneath it? And there are some people who think the physical universe is evil. There are people who believe that chocolate was put on the face of this earth to tempt you into obesity and acne. And it's evil, and it's to lure you away from the real thing we should be doing, namely praying. And we should do our best to meditate ourselves to a state where we no longer need chocolate. But there are others who say creation is good. And chocolate is an expression of God's love for us. And every time we enjoy a piece of chocolate, we're reminded that God gives us pleasures that we didn't need, but we certainly love. Which is the universe I want to believe in? Which is the universe that is most consistent with the orientation of my own soul? And I feel sorry for you if it's the first one. Other questions?
Okay, so can you kind of describe your feelings on the nature of truth? Is truth something, the pursuit of truth, something that is asymptotic, at least in this life, or not?
That's a beautiful way to put it. I think in this life, yeah. That I believe that there is actually truth. And I believe that everything we do attempts to get us closer and closer to truth. But I also recognize we never reach it, not in this life. And it gives me both humility and hope. I mean, if she was able to get the truth and I couldn't, boy, I'd be ticked. Not fair. How come you can do it and I can't? But if I realize that all of us are in the same boat and we're all stumbling to the truth, I can forgive myself for being wrong and I can forgive her for being wrong, unless you're my student. And what goes with that is an interesting difference I see between science and faith. Science are a set of human descriptions that try to describe the truth. Because they're human, they're imperfect, and they're never going to completely get there, which means I'll always be able to ask for more money to do more science. I'm never going to run out and say, oh, finished, we did the last bit of science, now what am I going to do? Never going to happen. But at the same time, I recognize that human descriptions, at least, are things that I can understand. So science starts with a point of what I understand, approaching the truth. Faith, I'm stuck with truths. I exist. She exists. He exists. We can love each other. We can hate each other. We can ignore each other. We're free to do these things. I have these yearnings at 3 in the morning, and I don't know where they come from, and I don't know what they're for. All of these are truths, and I don't understand them. And as I learn more in my faith life, mostly by hearing the history of all the other people who have gone through struggling with those truths, and every now and then getting a nudge from somebody who identifies himself as God, and I've got no right to say that was wrong. Although sometimes people get nudges and they think it's from God. No, I don't think so. And learning how to tell the difference is a trick. But with the help of a community of people, I can learn more from each other. I can learn more from our history. I can get an idea of what to look for and what not to look for. But I know that that understanding will never be perfect. I can understand better, but I'll never understand perfectly. So faith is truth seeking understanding, and science is understanding seeking truth. That's why they look an awful lot alike, but actually never really, you can't substitute the one for the other either way.
Hi.
Yeah, hi.
You gave your opinions on basically the beginning, how the universe was created and stuff like that, and the basis of religion. What are your thoughts on the ending of the universe, like the rubber band theory?
Mm-hmm. Oh, all these wonderful theories. About 15 years ago, there was a radio producer for BBC Radio in Bristol who recruited me to do a 5-part series, 15 minutes each, on the end of everything. And we went all over England and a couple of other places, talked to theorists who are working on what the end of the universe might be like, heard all sorts of different opinions. He did a great job of preparing me for it. And at the end of the day, I realized the fundamental differences. I can argue with some cogency that the Big Bang, which incidentally was invented by a Catholic, I hope you guys know that, George Lemaitre, that the Big Bang, there is evidence that I can use to choose, did it work, did it not work? I have evidence from the past. I have data from the past. I don't have any data from the future. And so at the end of the day, all I can do is extrapolate. If things keep going this way, that's the way it's always going to go. And you and I know that these extrapolations are never right, eventually. So it's marvelous to think about, because it raises interesting questions for me to contemplate in my heart. But I don't put a whole lot of faith in any of the possible answers. What I do know is this, that there is a really easy answer that Christians can be tempted to, which is, okay, universe, physical universe, goes away, who cares, because we're creatures with souls and we'll be off in some spiritual heaven and this universe doesn't matter. We're not angels. We're not even apprentice angels. We're not, the me is not Casper the Friendly Ghost inside this stupid body that's getting old and turning gray. No, this body is real and it matters. When Jesus Christ was the incarnation of the second person, he's saying the physical universe matters. He so loved the world that he became part of it. He didn't just, love Casper the ghost inside me. He loved the world. And he redeemed the world. And what we do in the world actually matters. It's not just a big test. Oops, you helped that little old lady cross the street, I guess you get in. No, the little old lady in and of herself mattered. It wasn't just a test to see if you were smart enough. We are told, if you read carefully what Christ says not that there is life after death. Christ doesn't promise us life after death. Christ promises us eternal life. How does that work? Beats the heck out of me. We have the resurrection. If you don't believe in the resurrection, there's no point in being a Christian. St. Paul says that. But scientific principle, if it did happen, it can happen. I have no idea how these meteorites came from Mars, but they came from Mars, so I better figure out how it happened. I have no idea where the resurrected Christ came from, but there it is. And not only that, but the promise is it can happen even to us. What was Christ, the resurrected Christ, like? He was not Casper the Friendly Ghost, because you could touch him. He would eat a fish dinner. He loved telling jokes. He was not just the same as a zombie walking around, like the undead, because he could do things that bodies can't do. He was hard to recognize until you're recognized, and then he was obvious to recognize. In other words, it's one of those things that words are having a hard time to describe, but it's real, and you had to be there. It means that however the world ultimately ends, whether it's, the heat death of the universe. Well, we have one other phrase that I always think about. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. You've got a poem that you've just written, and it's on the hard drive of your computer. The computer is suddenly run over by a steamroller, and the hard drive is lost. Is the poem lost? No. That poem will always be something that has existed. Ideas, words, can survive even as the things that contain them change. Maybe that gives us an idea. What is the soul like? Well, maybe it's kind of like the operating system of your computer, only it's more complicated than that. And that's just the best thing that we in 2017 can think of. And it's a picture that wouldn't have made sense 100 years ago. 100 years ago when people tried to figure out what is a human psyche like, they said, oh, it's like a steam engine. When you get mad, you've got to let off steam or else you'll explode. Well, that's true of steam engines. Why should that be true of human beings? But steam engines were the only complicated thing they knew at the time. And now we say, oh, the human psyche is like a program. If you keep doing the same thing, then you're programming yourself to always, well, is that really how it works? It's the only complicated thing we know now. 100 years from now, what complicated things will we use as an analogy for the human being and how the human being will continue? I don't know. But all of them are going to be analogies that fail eventually. The reality is, scandal of the particularity, you exist. There's nothing any one of us can do to change the fact that you exist. And 100 years from now when you're dead, you still will have existed. And that's a reality. And that reality is fixed for all time. Great stuff to contemplate. And if you get really good ideas, write a science fiction story.
If I could, I got a written question here
Sure.
from someone, and it asked, why did the Pope hire you? And I don't know that means hire you
Right.
or hire an
anybody.
astrologer.
Right, astronomer.
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 I said that to my kids, and they said, why did the Pope need an astrologer? And I said, no, different job.
Well, it's not to set the date of Easter. It's not to cast his horoscope. I was on a radio show once, and they were doing What's My Line with you. We have a guest, and the guest works for a world leader, and the guest studies astrology. Oh, you're Nancy Reagan's astrologer. No. Remember Nancy Reagan? She had an astrologer. Which, I mean, maybe we could use one now. At least there'd be a pattern to what's going on. The Pope decided 125 years ago to have an observatory for a practical reason and a theological reason. The practical reason was having a national observatory that was recognized by other national observatories was a way that the Vatican was recognized as a nation. And back in the 1890s, that was controversial. You know, because Italy had been unified, but the Vatican city-state was holding out. That's all been settled. They signed an agreement in 1929. The Vatican is now a city-state. The other was to just be a living sign that the church loves and supports science. The church isn't afraid of science. The church isn't trying to suppress science. And if none of you in this room remembers a single thing that I said, except maybe the joke about playing golf, you'll remember that there was a guy from MIT who works for the Pope. And that's really the only message, just to let people know that, you know, science is something that believers should embrace. Don't leave it to the end. Now, why me in particular? There's only a dozen of us working there. The previous director had served as 10 years, wanted to step down. 10 years was enough for anybody. Looking at the people available, there weren't that very many in my particular age group. For what they tended to hire, but they hired a whole bunch of astronomers in the 1930s, and they all retired in the 1970s. And then they hired a whole new bunch of astronomers in the 1970s, and they are all retiring about 25 in 2005, 2010. And I was one of the few that had been hired not part of that cohort. So I was the right age, the right place, and the right time. Also, I suspect that they may have realized a lot of the job of being the director is public speaking, and that's something I'm good at. Incidentally, you want to be scientists? Learn public speaking, learn writing, learn languages. You can't do science unless you can explain it to somebody else. So whatever you can do to improve your ability to explain things to others. I have seen more often than not 3 people come to a meeting with exactly the same theory, and the theory that everybody accepts and quotes and cites and gives you a job for is the one that has the best figure, because that's the one they can figure out. There was a case when I was back-to-back with somebody who gave exactly the same paper I was going to give. He gave his first, but English wasn't his first language, and nobody could follow what he was saying. Public expression is key to being able to do science. Learn that now. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that you're a good example of the opposite of what I'm about to say. But how do you feel about the reputation that religion has for maybe being more divisive? And then the follow-up would be, how do you feel about the convergence of religions as far as the way that, you know, Catholics and Protestants and maybe Buddhists or Hinduists, you know, can work together for some ultimate truth or some sort of, and then throw science in there if you want.
2 things about religion that we have to accept as unpleasant, but in some ways important. The better something is, the worse it is when it gets abused. Patriotism is a wonderful thing. Turning it into nationalism is suddenly not a good thing. I love my football team. I love my baseball team. If that means that I go and, you know, beat up somebody who's wearing a different jacket, that's not a good thing. If there's content to religion, if there's good in religion, we shouldn't be surprised that it looks really bad when it turns bad. And the way you stop yourself from turning bad is by having friends around you who think, am I crazy? And they go, yeah, you are. Pull back. You need somebody to hold you back when you want to get yourself into a really stupid fight. So religion can be a source of discord. And if it's doing its job right, maybe it ought to be at times. If if it's not making you feel unsettled, you're going to the wrong church. Because it means that you think you're already perfect and you've just surrounded yourself with sycophants. That's also true of whatever science you're doing. If you don't feel uncomfortable with some piece of science, then you don't know where to study next. What was the other one?
How religion works together.
How religions work together. One of the great things is recognizing that we believe there's one truth. And we believe we're all, trying to climb the mountain different ways. I did an interesting thing about 10 years ago as part of a Jesuit project where I spent 2 months living in Silicon Valley talking to my techie friends about their understanding of religion. What do they think religion is? How do they think it works? People from all religions, no religions. The biggest sticking point that most of them have is, if religion is true, then how come there are so many of them, and how do I choose one from another? And one guy said, I was a Presbyterian, and this is a great church, and then they brought in a Catholic priest to talk to us, and he was really good. And then they brought in a rabbi to talk to us, and he was really good. And I'm thinking, well, they can't all be right, so they must all be wrong. What? But I can see his point of view. If you've got a box and you're trying to tweak to get the best signal, and you turn a knob and you don't see anything happening, you assume, well, that knob must not be connected to anything. And if that's the way you're viewing religion, well, you can turn the knob enough and you wind up in Scientology, and then you realize, okay, the knob is doing something. But the differences can be subtle, but the richness that each point of view offers can also be very, very important. I think we are all attempting to converge on the same truth. And just as I will listen to a scientist whose theory is different from mine, but has some really interesting data, and who has a technique different from the technique I use, but maybe that's a useful technique, I will always want to listen to the people who are interested in the same thing I'm interested in. But at the end of the day, I know I have to choose, that I can't just be a little bit of this and a little bit of that and try to find Jesus on my own. Because then I don't have the community of people supporting me when I'm down, stopping me when I'm about to do something stupid, teaching me what they've been able to learn, giving me their kids that I can teach them what I've been able to learn. We need community. We need big science. We need big religion. But I do see a real difference in this generation compared to when I was a kid. When I was a kid, 1950s, our best friends, the Schutz up the street, were Lutherans. Not only that, Missouri Lutherans. And it was probably even more daring for them to have Catholic friends. And in the 50s, that was radical. But we've all grown up with friends of many religions. And the leaders of our churches have themselves grown up comfortable with that. I think the unity of the churches is going to happen in this way, from below, so that you have, Pope Francis talking with Lutherans, celebrating the Reformation, recognizing, there are a lot of heresies back in the Roman times, and none of them lasted more than a generation. If Protestantism has lasted 500 years, maybe God's telling us Catholics that we've got something to learn from them. And vice versa. And we do see a convergence of, oh, when you said that, you really meant, I totally misunderstood that. I guess that's as far as I can go with that answer. But I see it's an unfinished process. At the end of the day, each of us has to make a commitment. And it's not a bad thing to stick with that commitment, but to recognize that every process is unfinished. Every understanding is unfinished.
So I was really taken by Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, I think it was called.
Yep.
And it seemed to me to be a model for somebody who's, I don't think he was a scientist, but he certainly is conversant with science.
He actually studied chemistry.
Okay.
Yeah, he was more of a chemical engineer, but he also had some really good advisors, not me.
Okay.
But people from Argentina that he could speak with in his own language who helped him out.
But he clearly knew what he was talking about when he was writing about science. And the thing that was interesting to me was the way that he connected science and moral life. You know, it's like we have this data coming from science, and it puts on us a moral obligation to change the way we're living. And living in this country, you grew up in this country, now you spend your time all over the world. But in this country especially, there's a problem with putting science and religion together. You can have very intelligent people who are educated in science who say, well, yeah, but because we have this data coming in about ocean temperatures and so forth, that doesn't mean I need to do anything. It doesn't mean I need to get rid of my stock in this oil company or whatever. And I just wonder if you can comment on why do you think that's such a problem in America, and how do we get past it?
Yeah, and it's a new problem. I remember growing up, evolution wasn't a problem in the Catholic schools. The nuns taught me evolution. I remember growing up that science was always good and science was going to win the Cold War and beat those terrible communists. We had our own blind spots then, different from the blind spots now. A lot of it, I think, is just the social change that's occurred and the certainties that we once grew up with that are unsettling to let go of. And some of the social changes are not changes for the better. I think an awful lot of this, I'm old enough to have seen that an awful lot of the sexual revolution really hurt a whole lot of people in ways that wasn't supposed to happen. One of the ironies is the most socially advanced sexual revolution types, who are the young guys in my generation who are scientists, are now the ones who are being accused by their grad students of abuse of women, which they're doing. And they were brought up thinking, well, that's the way it's supposed to be. It's the brave new world. We can do anything we want. Well, no. A lot of social change is good. When my dad was going through the business world, he had to face prejudice because he was an Italian. Nobody would think of that anymore. But this unsettling social change has meant that people will take sides in the culture wars and think they have to buy in on one side or another. The fear of change makes them vulnerable to easy answers and fundamentalisms on both sides. That said, the answer is not to fight the fundamentalism so much as to fight the fear. What's the one thing that Jesus always says, especially post-resurrection? Don't be afraid. If he's ever given any command 1,000 times, it's not about the environment, it's not about sex, it's not about money, it's don't be afraid. Trust me. Love. And then the other pieces will fall in place. It's real easy to live a life where I've got it all figured out, and once I've got it all figured out, every new piece of information that comes in, I can fit into the system I've already got. We do that in science all the time. That's how science works. I've got a way of looking at the world, and I get this data, aha, just as I expected. It fits right there. But what that means ultimately is that people are not going to be convinced by evidence. People are not going to be convinced by arguments. No one was ever converted by a syllogism. What does change people's hearts? Experience is what does it. And usually the experience of knowing and loving somebody who you thought was part of that other group that you were going to hate. So if you don't have friends who disagree with you, you're not opening yourself up to at least understanding who they are and where they're coming from. I quoted this at dinner last night, Raisa Maritain, who was a convert, who said what caused her to convert was recognizing the existence of holiness. A universe that has holiness in it. If your explanation of the universe doesn't have room for the fact that there are holy people, then your explanation is incomplete. When I was a student in the 70s, my hair was about as long as yours, and I didn't have a beard. And I was one of these, only it didn't even look as good because it was kind of growing out like that, Bozo the Clown-like. And I remember going home for Christmas, and, you know, Mr. Menino lived up the road. He said to my dad afterwards, I used to never think much of those long-haired kids, but, you know, your son's okay. Maybe not all bad. And I think that human experience is what we really need to go through. We need to get out of our comfort zones and live someplace to see what it's like to be poor, to see what it's like to be rich, to see what it's like to have an IQ of 30 or 170. Those experiences make you a whole lot less afraid of having them again. I'll end with this, that, you know, I was in the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps was wonderful. And if you're ever thinking of the Peace Corps, boy, can I recommend it. You get yourself out of the country for 2 years, you're suddenly somebody who matters in the village where you are, you become incredibly self-reliant, you come home, and nothing will scare you. Because you faced it, and it turned out to be not nearly as scary as you thought it was going to be. You know, I didn't want to spend 2 years living where there's no flush toilets, just a long drop. You know what? The first time you have to use the long drop, you use the long drop. You know what a long drop is? Yeah. And then you're not scared of it anymore. I recommend that highly. But likewise, to be able to go to places that you think are scary and to recognize, no, I can face that. I can do that. Do not be afraid. We're out of time? Thanks.